Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The night over Dry Creek Ridge settled in without color, the kind of cold darkness that quieted even the usual sounds of the plains. Cole Merrick stepped out onto his porch with a lantern hanging from 2 fingers, letting its dim light fall across the yard. He scanned the shadows with a practiced calm, though tension sat in the back of his neck. Bishop should have been here. The dog never wandered far, not without reason, and this made the third night Cole had stepped outside to an empty yard. He stayed still for a long moment, not calling the dog's name, just listening. The silence felt wrong. Even the wind moved lightly, barely touching the grass. Cole lowered the lantern, jaw tightening. He didn't like not understanding what was happening. It put him on edge, the same edge he worked hard to keep buried since the day he lost his brother. He set the lantern down on the porch rail, adjusted his coat, and stepped off the porch. He checked the dirt for prints the way a man checks for snakes without thinking. Careful, steady movements, eyes sharp. Bishop's tracks were faint in the hardened ground, but clear enough to follow. They angled toward the eastern field, straight toward the old graveyard that nobody spoke about unless forced. Cole closed the cabin door quietly and started walking. The lantern swung with his steps, lighting only a narrow slice of the dark. His breath came in thin clouds. His thoughts stayed tight. If the dog found something dangerous, I should have gone sooner. He pushed the idea away, keeping his pace even. The path toward the graveyard stretched wide and empty. His boots pressed into loose dirt, leaving solid prints behind him. The fence posts that lined the edge of the old burial ground leaned under years of neglect. Cole paused at the entrance, tightening his grip on the lantern. He scanned the rows of tilted headstones. Nothing moved. "Bishop," he called softly. No answer, just a faint shift of grass. He stepped forward, heartbeat steady but heavier than usual. Something in his gut warned him this wasn't a simple case of a curious dog. The closer he got, the colder the air felt. His boots crunched lightly over brittle grass. His eyes adjusted, picking up the shapes between gravestones. Then he saw Bishop standing stiff near the back row, tail low, head lowered toward something on the ground. Cole's pace changed, slower but direct. Bishop didn't turn or bark. He just stood there, tense and alert, as if guarding whatever he had found. Cole lifted the lantern higher, letting light spill across the nearest stones. The glow caught metal first, thin iron chains stretching between 2 cracked headstones. Then he saw a pair of slender wrists bound by the cuffs, the skin rubbed raw and swollen. His breath stuck for a second. A young Apache woman sat slumped between the stones, her knees drawn in, her head bowed, so low her hair nearly hid her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and chest, exposing bruises made by hands that didn't care about the damage. Dirt clung to her legs. She wasn't moving much. Her breathing came shallow through parted lips. Cole took a step closer, then forced himself to stop. He didn't want to startle her. She looked too close to breaking. His mind ran through possibilities fast. Who did this? How long has she been here? Why did everyone believe she died if she was left like this? None of it made sense, and the more he looked at her, the more anger pressed at the back of his ribs. It wasn't loud anger. It was the quiet kind he had carried for years, the kind that didn't let go once it settled. The woman didn't react to his footsteps. She seemed past the point of reacting. Cole lowered himself to one knee, moving slow. The cold from the ground pushed through his trousers, but he ignored it. "It's all right," he said, voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her shoulders flinched, so slightly he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her so closely. She didn't lift her head. She didn't try to pull away from the chains. It was the reaction of someone who'd learned that resistance only brought worse pain. Cole swallowed hard. He angled the lantern so she wouldn't have to stare into the glare if she looked up. His hands hovered near the chains, careful and visible. "I'm going to check these," he murmured. She didn't speak, but she turned her head a fraction, just enough to show she had heard him. Her eyes finally lifted. They were dark and exhausted, but sharp underneath the weariness. Fear sat deep inside them, and something like expectation, like she already knew men came here only to confirm she was still alive or nearly gone. Cole held her gaze without pushing anything into it. No pity, no force, just a quiet acknowledgement of what she had survived. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal tool. She tensed again, breath catching. He paused, only to open the cuffs, he said gently. After a moment, she gave the smallest nod. It wasn't confidence. It was resignation mixed with a thread of hope. Cole worked the first lock slowly, aware of how her breathing changed each time the metal clicked. His hand was steady, movements practiced. When the cuff released, her wrist dropped weakly, and she exhaled in a shaky, painful breath that sounded like her first real breath in days. He opened the second cuff and eased her hand free. Her skin was cold, roughened from iron and weather. He slipped his coat off and placed it around her shoulders. She tried to adjust the heavy fabric, but winced at the movement. "We're going," he said softly. "You're not staying here another hour." He slid an arm around her back, lifting her carefully. She was lighter than he expected. Too light. Bishop walked beside them, keeping close enough that his warm body brushed her leg now and then. She didn't resist the help. She didn't cling either. She simply leaned toward Cole, just enough to stay upright. Every few steps, she shivered. Every few steps, Cole felt a spike of anger at whoever had done this. But he kept his breathing even. She didn't need his anger right now. She needed steadiness. When they reached the cabin door, Cole looked down at her. Her eyes had dimmed again, but she stayed conscious, watching him with a kind of exhausted trust that made him feel the weight of what he was doing. Inside, he lowered her near the stove and added wood until flames rose bright and warm. She watched him with a tight, uncertain expression, waiting to see if this kindness had a cost. He knelt to clean her wrists, dipping a cloth in warm water. She tensed once when he touched the raw skin, then forced herself still. He noticed. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're inside now." Her eyes flickered, not quite relief, but something close. She didn't speak when he offered water. She took it with trembling hands, holding the cup close to her chest, as if expecting it to be taken back. When he stepped away to fetch another blanket, she reached out and caught the edge of his coat sleeve. Not gripping hard, not holding him back, just a small touch that told him she wasn't ready to be left alone. He paused, looked at her, and nodded once. "I'm right here," he said. She let go slowly. Cole knelt beside her again, the fire warming both of them, and realized the fear in his chest had shifted. It wasn't fear of danger anymore. It was fear of failing someone who clearly had no one else left. He stayed there until her eyes finally closed, not trusting sleep but unable to fight it. And for the first time in years, Cole understood that something in his life had already changed, and he had made that decision the moment he stepped into the graveyard. Cole woke before dawn, the same way he had for years, alert, still, listening to the room before he moved. The cabin was cold except for the steady warmth coming from the stove, where the fire had burned down to soft orange coals. He sat up slowly, letting his eyes adjust. Nayeli slept on the blankets he'd laid out near the stove, her small frame curled tight, his coat wrapped around her shoulders. Her breathing was uneven at first, then steadied into a soft, fragile rhythm. Bishop lay beside her, head on his paws, watching her with a kind of protective focus that Cole hadn't seen from the dog toward anyone but himself. Cole rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the night settle fully. He had found her, freed her, brought her here. There was no going back from that. He didn't regret it, but the responsibility sat heavy on his mind. Whoever chained her might come looking someday, and he needed to be ready for that. But right now, she needed warmth, food, rest, things much simpler than danger. He stood carefully, not wanting to wake her. The floorboards creaked anyway, and she stirred, body tensing instinctively. Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused at first. The moment she recognized the cabin instead of the graveyard, her chest rose in a shaky breath. But when she noticed Cole standing there, her body stiffened again. He kept his voice low and steady. "Morning's coming. Just stoking the fire." She didn't answer, but the tightness in her shoulders eased slightly. Her gaze flicked to Bishop, who thumped his tail once, then settled again. That seemed to reassure her more than Cole's words. The fire caught quickly as he added fresh wood. Heat spread through the cabin, enough that she loosened her grip on the blanket. Cole moved to the stove, pulled out the old tin pot, and started heating water. He could feel her watching him from the corner of her eye, cautious, quiet, analyzing every movement. He understood that kind of watching. It meant she wasn't sure yet if he was safe. When he set the pot on the stove, she shifted and tried to sit up straighter. Her movements were stiff, as if her muscles argued against every adjustment. She winced once, but didn't make sound. "You don't need to get up yet," Cole said gently. She paused, not trusting the softness in his tone. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the coat. He continued, keeping his back partly turned so she wouldn't feel pressured. "You're hurt. Rest while the fire warms the room." It took a few seconds, but she slowly lowered herself back against the blanket, still watching him like she was waiting to see the real cost of being here. Cole worked quietly, cleaning a small tin plate, slicing what little dried meat he had left, stirring oats into the boiling water. Every task seemed louder than usual with her eyes following him. He wasn't used to being observed like this. Most of his life these days was spent alone, with only Bishop as company. Having another person in his cabin felt strange, heavy, and familiar at the same time. When breakfast was ready, he crouched beside her and set the bowl down within her reach. "It's hot," he warned softly. "Eat slow." She didn't reach for it. She stared at the bowl like she had to decide whether accepting food would tie her to him in some binding way. Cole looked away, giving her the space to make whatever choice she needed to make. A long moment passed. Then her hand moved, hesitant, shaking slightly. She pulled the bowl toward her chest and ate in small, careful spoonfuls. Her eyes flicked up once, checking that he wasn't watching too closely. When she realized he wasn't, her shoulders dropped half an inch, her guard easing by the smallest degree. While she ate, Cole stood and moved to the window, scanning the plains for movement out of habit. Nothing but wind. He felt her gaze shift to him again. He wondered what she saw: a stranger, a threat, the man who freed her, or just another unknown risk. When she finished the last spoonful, she set the bowl down with both hands, almost reverently, as if she wasn't used to anything being hers to finish. Cole walked over slowly. "Your wrists need looking after." Her breath caught. She pulled her hands back a little but didn't hide them. Cole knelt beside her, waiting until she nodded once. It was a small signal, but it meant trust, fragile, uncertain trust. He washed the raw skin again with warm water. She winced only once, but didn't pull away. He kept his touch steady, his expression unreadable, not wanting her to mistake concern for pity. He had been pitted once in his life, and it had felt like being stripped bare. He wouldn't do that to her. Her eyes followed his movements. She seemed to study the way he handled her injuries, almost confused by the care. When he finished, she breathed out quietly. Her voice came unexpectedly, soft and hoarse. You didn't leave me." He froze for a short moment, the words landing harder than anything he expected to hear this morning. He met her gaze, and for the first time her eyes weren't full of fear. They held a tired kind of disbelief. "I wasn't going to," he said. "Not then. Not now." She processed that with a slow blink, as if trying to understand why someone would choose that. Bishop nudged her knee with his nose. She placed a trembling hand on his head again, this time with more certainty. The dog leaned into her palm with a low sigh. Cole watched the moment, a tightness forming in his chest. She connected easier with the dog than with him. That made sense. Animals had fewer ways to betray. He stood and stepped back to give her space. She followed him with her eyes again, but something had changed in them, still guarded, but not as distant. The morning light crept through the window. She stayed near the stove, warmed, fed, no longer chained to a graveyard waiting to disappear. Cole quietly acknowledged the truth forming between them. He wasn't just giving her shelter. He had taken responsibility for her survival, and she was beginning to understand that. And whether he was ready for it or not, that responsibility already felt permanent. By midday, the wind picked up, brushing cold air against the cabin walls and rattling loose boards along the porch. Cole stepped outside long enough to haul in more firewood, his breath turning white in front of him. He worked in steady rhythm, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman sitting inside. Every time he looked toward the window, he found her silhouette watching, still, silent, trying to understand the man who had dragged her out of hell without asking for anything in return. When he carried the last armful of wood indoors, Nayeli shifted slightly, straightening as if bracing herself. She wasn't trembling anymore, not the way she had last night, but her posture stayed tight, aware of every movement near her. "I'm just putting this by the stove," Cole said, voice calm, meant to ease the tension he saw climbing into her shoulders again. She didn't answer. She simply watched him, eyes sharp and careful. He placed the wood down, dusted off his hands, and sat on the far stool to mend a broken strap on his saddlebag. He noticed her glancing at his hands more than his face, studying the old scars, the steady way he handled the leather, the absence of sudden movements. It was the same way wounded animals watched a new caretaker. Quiet, measured, deciding if the person meant survival or danger. Minutes passed. The firelight shifted across the walls. Bishop lay between them, chin on his paws, his tail making a faint thump whenever Nayeli's breathing changed. Cole spoke first, without looking up from the strap. "You can tell me if something hurts. Wounds, cold, anything." A soft inhale, then a pause. She wrapped the blanket tighter over her legs. He continued stitching. "Or if you want water. Or if you'd rather I keep distance. Just say it." Her eyes lowered to the blanket, fingers tightening on the fabric. The way she swallowed told him she was thinking hard about words, about trust, about whether anything she said would actually matter after what she'd lived through. A quiet moment passed. Then she whispered, barely above breath, "Nayeli." Cole's hand still mid-stitch. He lifted his head. She kept her gaze on the floor, as if saying her name out loud felt heavier than the chain she'd worn. "What's that?" he asked gently. She lifted her eyes to his, uncertain, bracing herself. "My name." He let the silence hold for a moment, not rushing it. Her name felt fragile, like something she hadn't spoken in weeks, maybe longer. "All right," he said softly. "Nayeli." The sound settled in the room, warm and steady. She blinked once, her expression shifting in a way he couldn't quite read, but it wasn't fear. Her fingers loosened slightly on the blanket, a subtle release of tension. He went back to stitching the strap, not because he needed to finish it right away, but because he sensed she needed quiet after giving something so personal. After a few minutes, she spoke again, voice thin. "Cole." He looked up. She held his coat around her shoulders like armor, her lips parted with careful intent. "You brought me here," she said. "Why?" He heard the real question underneath. "Why didn't you leave me? Why risk yourself? Why care?" Cole breathed slowly through his nose. He rarely explained himself to anyone. But her eyes weren't the eyes of a woman demanding answers. They were the eyes of someone who had never been given a reason to believe in mercy. "I wasn't going to let you die out there," he said. "Not like that. Not alone." Her chest rose sharply, as though she hadn't expected honesty. She lowered her gaze again, but not to hide. Her breathing had softened. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, revealing the bruising along her jaw more clearly. Cole felt anger tighten in him again. He kept it deep, showing it would only frighten her. He spoke quieter now. "Nobody deserves to be left chained like an animal. Nobody." Her hands trembled faintly, and she hid them inside the blanket. She didn't speak for a long time, and Cole didn't push her to. Instead, he reached for a bowl of warm water and gestured gently to her wrists. "Fresh bandages. It'll help." She hesitated. Trust didn't come easy. Every inch she moved toward him was a decision. After a few seconds, she extended her arm, slowly, as if expecting pain. Cole took her wrist with careful hands, applying warm water to the raw skin. She inhaled sharply once, then steadied herself. Her eyes stayed on his face, watching for any sign of cruelty, any flicker of intention she should fear. She saw none. When he wrapped the soft cloth around her wrist, her fingers brushed as lightly, not by accident, not quite on purpose. A cautious test. Cole stayed still, giving her space to pull back if she chose. She didn't. After he finished, she whispered, "Thank you." It came awkwardly, shaped by discomfort and vulnerability, but real. Cole stood slowly, not wanting to overwhelm the brief moment of openness. He stepped aside and began cleaning his tools. Behind him, Naeli exhaled deeply, the first unguarded breath he'd heard from her. Bishop shifted closer to her, resting his head on her knee. This time, she placed her hand on his fur without hesitation. She had spoken her name. She had allowed his hands to tend her wounds. She had thanked him. Small steps, but for someone who had been left to disappear in silence, these were monumental. Cole felt it settle inside him. This wasn't just the aftermath of saving someone. This was the beginning of her coming back to life. And whether he was ready for it or not, he was becoming someone she trusted enough to take that first step. The next morning brought a thin layer of frost across the yard, the kind that made the ground crunch beneath Cole's boots as he stepped outside. The sky was pale, still holding the last traces of dawn. He spent the early hours splitting wood, checking the fence line, and hauling water, tasks he had done alone for years. But now, every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the cabin window. She watched him from there. Naeli, her face partly hidden behind the frame, her expression unreadable but alert. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't slumped in exhaustion. She was observing, trying to understand the rhythm of a world she had been ripped from and now thrust back into. Cole carried the final load of wood inside and felt the shift in the air immediately. Naeli straightened from where she'd been sitting near the stove, hands folded tightly in her lap. The blanket he'd given her rested across her legs. Bishop sat beside her, tail tapping the floor once before settling. "Cold out," Cole said, shaking the last dust of frost from his gloves. She nodded slowly, her eyes following the movement of his hands. Her gaze had changed over the past day, still guarded, but not as hollow. She was paying attention now, measuring her safety moment by moment. Cole set the wood down and removed his coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. "I'll make coffee. You hungry?" She hesitated. A long pause, then a small, careful nod. He didn't smile. He kept things simple. If he showed too much soft expression, she might think it was a trick. So instead, he moved to the stove, added more wood, and started the morning in the quiet, steady way she seemed to tolerate best. Naeli shifted a little, adjusting the blanket. "Can I help?" she asked, voice soft and unsure, as if she expected him to refuse her any role in her own survival. Cole turned to her gently. "You don't need to do anything yet. You're still healing." She lowered her eyes, the words striking her in a way he didn't miss. She wasn't used to being told to rest. She was used to being treated like a problem to manage, not a person whose well-being mattered. He softened his tone. "But if you want to do something, you can hand me the tin cup. Just the one there." Her eyes followed where he pointed, a simple cup on the table. She reached for it, careful not to strain her wrists, and handed it over. It was a small act, but she did it with quiet focus, like she was relearning how to take part in ordinary moments. "Thank you," Cole said. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Gratitude had been expected from her all her life. But someone thanking her was different. She held on to that moment longer than she realized. As the water heated, Cole moved around the cabin with slow, steady steps. Naeli watched each movement, her gaze tracking him not out of fear this time, but out of curiosity, like she was piecing together who he really was. When he handed her a bowl of warm food, she accepted it without hesitation, her fingers brushing his briefly. Light, accidental, but real. She looked away quickly afterward, the contact making her nervous. They ate in silence, Bishop shifting between them, the only sound the fire's crackle and the steady rhythm of Cole's spoon against the bowl. After she finished, Naeli pulled the blanket tighter. "They never let me rest," she said quietly, almost to herself. Cole set his bowl aside and gave her time. "They said resting meant thinking," she continued. "And thinking meant remembering. And remembering meant trouble." Her fingers tightened on the blanket. Bishop lifted his head, sensing her tension. He moved closer, pressing his warm body gently against her shin. Cole's voice came low, grounded. "You can rest here. As long as you need. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first extended moment of the morning. There was caution still, but also something new, something that looked almost like relief. After breakfast, she stood for the first time unassisted. Her posture was stiff, her injuries pulling at her movements, but she stood. Cole watched carefully. "Take it slow," he said. She nodded, testing her weight on her legs. When she swayed, slightly, Bishop nudged her from the other side, as though offering balance. She steadied herself, breathing through the discomfort. Cole stepped closer, not enough to impose, but enough to catch her if she fell. "Want to sit by the door? Sun will warm you faster than the stove." She took a moment, then nodded. He fetched the chair, setting it in the patch of sunlight coming through the door. She sat gingerly, the warmth touching her face. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the calm she hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. Cole stood nearby, watching her shoulders loosen, watching the fear unwind a fraction at a time. As the morning passed, a subtle routine formed, without words, without planning, just a natural shaping of moments that settled into place. Cole worked. Nayeli rested where she could watch him. Bishop stayed between them, bridging distance neither was ready to close. By midday, Nayeli shifted again. "You work alone?" she asked quietly. "Most days," Cole said. "Been that way a long time." She studied him, a slow, thoughtful look. He returned to his tasks, repairing tack on the small table. She watched the way his fingers moved, the precision of each stitch. Her posture softened a little, the anxiety in her shoulders fading with each minute she observed him without threat. After a long stretch of quiet, Nayeli spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "I want to help." "You already did," Cole said without looking up. "You asked." She blinked at that, confused. He continued. "Asking means you're starting to feel safe. That's enough for today." She stared at him, unsure how to respond. No one had ever told her that her feelings mattered. Not like this. Not without expecting something in return. The cabin stayed warm and quiet, sunlight pouring through the door, dust drifting lazily in the beams. Cole looked at her once more. "Tomorrow, if you feel stronger, you can help with a few things. Nothing heavy, just what feels right." She nodded slowly, letting the idea settle. A faint calm spread across her face. Then something subtle happened, something Cole didn't expect. As he passed her to lay another log on the fire, her hand brushed his sleeve. It wasn't a grab or a plea or a fearful touch. It was gentle, deliberate, a tiny attempt to feel connected to the one safe thing she had. Cole stopped for 1 second, allowing her that touch, then moved on without making herself conscious. She withdrew her hand slowly, but her breathing had changed, steadier, more grounded. A new routine had formed between them. Not just survival, not just caretaker and wounded stranger. Something else was beginning to take shape, quiet, cautious, and real. The wind that morning carried a dry, restless hum across the yard, brushing against the windows and slipping through the cracks in the cabin walls. Cole came inside after checking the far fence line, brushing dust from his coat as he closed the door behind him. The moment he stepped into the room, he noticed a shift in Nayeli's posture. She wasn't sitting by the stove today. She was at the small table, blankets still around her shoulders, hands folded tightly. Her eyes lifted to him with a kind of quiet urgency, fear mixed with determination. Bishop stood near her chair, sensing the tension, tail low, ears forward. Cole removed his hat and hung it on the peg. "You all right?" he asked softly. Nayeli swallowed. She looked toward the window, then back at him. Her fingers dug slightly into the blanket. "I need to tell you," she said. He froze where he stood. Her voice wasn't shaking the way it usually did. It held weight. Decision. Pain carefully contained. "All right," Cole said, not moving closer yet. "Whenever you're ready." She nodded once, small, stiff, and took a slow breath. The fire crackled softly behind her, the only sound breaking the stillness. "They said I helped them," she whispered. "The men who raided near the ridge. They said it was me." Cole eased into the chair across from her, keeping his movements slow so she wouldn't feel cornered. "But you didn't." Nayeli shook her head, shoulders tightening. "I try to warn my people. I ran and shouted. They did not believe me. Thought I lured danger toward them. Thought I wanted trouble for them. She paused, breath unsteady. So they handed me over. The words hung heavy. Not dramatic, just devastating. Cole's jaw tightened. Betrayed by her own. Abandoned by the town. Chained in a graveyard like a crime someone wanted forgotten. It sank into him with a force he kept hidden behind his calm expression. What happened next? He asked gently. Her eyes flickered downward to her wrists wrapped in fresh bandages. They told the town I was guilty, she said quietly. They told them I was dangerous. That I would bring more raids if they let me walk free. She shifted slightly, wincing at the memory. Town didn't argue. They never looked at me. Never asked questions. Easier that way. Cole felt something cold settle under his ribs. He had seen towns twist truth before. Didn't matter if it was about cattle rustlers or a woman in distress. Easier to believe a lie than stand up to the men telling it. They chained me in the graveyard, Nayeli continued. Not to kill me. Not with their hands. They wanted nature to do it. Wind. Cold. Animals. Her voice dropped. No noise. No blood. No blame. She blinked hard, fighting to keep her composure. And then they told everyone I died. Cole leaned forward slightly, his voice low. How long were you there? She shook her head. I do not know days. Only cold. Only hunger. Only waiting. Her breath strained. When her dog came the first night, I thought it was a spirit or a dream, but it was warm. It stayed beside me. Her eyes finally lifted to his, and the rawness in them caught him off guard. And then you came, she whispered. Cole swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. He remembered her eyes in the graveyard, empty, fading, almost ready to let go. He hadn't realized how close she had been to disappearing entirely. Nayeli continued, voice small but steady. When you touched the chains, I thought you would tighten them, or leave me there. But you did not. Her fingers gripped the blanket again, knuckles pale. I did not understand why you helped, she said. No one did before. No one. Cole exhaled slowly. He felt a heat build in his chest. Not anger at her, but at the men who had done this. At the town that had accepted the lie. At himself, for not having looked sooner. You didn't deserve any of it, he said firmly. None. Her chin trembled once. She pushed down the emotion with visible effort, straightening her spine. They will come, she said quietly, eyes drifting toward the window again. The ones who did this. They will not want anyone to know I am alive. Cole leaned back slightly, steadying himself. Let them come. She stiffened, startled by the certainty in his tone. He softened it, but didn't back away. You're not alone anymore. They don't get to decide what happens to you next. Nayeli stared at him, her breathing unsteady, trying to judge whether he meant it or whether it was something men said when they didn't understand the danger. Cole held her gaze, making sure she saw nothing false in his eyes. You're safe here, he said. They won't lay a hand on you again. Her lips parted slightly, a small exhale escaping. Not relief, something closer to disbelief trying to turn into trust. She lowered her eyes. I do not want to bring trouble to your home. You didn't, Cole said. They did. The room went quiet again. Then, in a slow, vulnerable movement, Nayeli brought one hand out from the blanket and placed it lightly on the table between them. Her fingers trembled. Cole didn't reach across the space, but he set his hand near hers, close enough for her to feel the warmth, far enough not to scare her. She watched the space between their hands. Then her breathing softened. She wasn't ready for touch. Not fully, but she was ready to sit across from him with her guard lowered. For her, that was more than enough. For Cole, it was everything. In that quiet morning light, the truth settled between them like something too heavy to ignore. Her past had nearly killed her. His decision had saved her. And now their futures were tied closer than either had planned. Held together by survival, honesty, and a fragile trust that was beginning to feel like the first step towards something deeper. The sun dropped behind a ridge early that evening, leaving the yard covered in long shadows and the cabin wrapped in a quiet that felt different from the nights before. Cole finished securing the barn door, checking that no loose boards rattled in the rising wind, then headed back toward the warm glow escaping through the cabin window. Inside, Nayeli sat near the fire, legs tucked beneath the blanket, her posture still but no longer collapsed inward. She looked up the moment he entered, her eyes following him with a careful attention that hadn't existed on the first day. Bishop lay at her feet, his head resting across her ankles as if he had taken permanent ownership of the spot. Cole shut the door and hung his coat on the peg. Cold came in fast, he said quietly. Naeli nodded, gaze shifting briefly toward the window before returning to him. Outside looks empty, she murmured, voice soft but no longer trembling. Most nights do, Cole replied, carrying a stack of kindling toward the stove. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't want to disturb the fragile ease that had settled between them. The fire cracked softly as he added wood. The room warmed quickly, filling with the steady orange glow that softened the rough edges of the cabin's walls. He poured her a cup of warm water and set it within reach. "Drink a little," he said. "It helps the bruising." She wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat sink into her skin. When she took a sip, her shoulders eased. That small shift, barely noticeable to most, landed heavily for Cole. She was beginning to feel safe enough to relax, if only for moments. He settled onto the stool beside her, but kept a bit of space between them, giving her room to retreat if she needed it. She didn't retreat. Instead, she turned slightly toward him, her profile lit by the firelight. The bruising along her jaw had faded to a softer shade, her skin warmer than before. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire made a soft popping sound. Bishop sighed and shifted his weight. Outside, the wind grazed the boards, but it felt far away compared to the quiet inside. Cole's voice finally broke the silence. "You're healing faster than I expected." Naeli looked down at her hands, fingers brushing lightly along the rim of the cup. "Your food helps. The warmth and the quiet." He nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her words. She took a slow breath and lifted her chin. "When I close my eyes now, I do not see the stones." That surprised him. "Good," he said softly. She added, "I see your dog. I see him lying beside me." Bishop's ears perked as if understanding his name. Naeli reached down and touched his fur. "He kept me warm," she said quietly. "He kept me here." Cole watched her hand move gently through the dog's coat. The tenderness in that gesture struck him with a quiet force. For someone who had survived isolation, betrayal, and near death, showing care, even to a dog, meant she was stepping back into life in small, determined ways. Cole shifted his weight and sat closer, not touching her, but aligning himself with her warmth. Naeli noticed. Her eyes lifted slightly, then lingered on his face with an expression he hadn't seen yet, soft, uncertain, hopeful. He'd seen that look before in other people long ago, but never directed at him with this kind of quiet intensity. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said, voice low. Her lips parted slightly, her breathing deepening. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I know." She looked at him again, really looked. The firelight reflected in her eyes, showing the fatigue she still carried, but also something steadier. Her hand drifted slightly toward him on the blanket before she seemed to realize and pulled it back halfway. Cole didn't let her retreat fully. Slowly, he set his hand on the floor a few inches from hers, a clear but gentle offering. Her eyes flicked to the space between their hands. Her breath caught once. Then, with a hesitation that lasted several seconds, she moved her fingers toward his. Just the tips, just enough to feel warm skin instead of cold iron. Her hand trembled, but she didn't pull away. The quiet connection tightened something in Cole's chest. His jaw softened. He turned his hand slightly, allowing her fingers to rest against his. When her breathing steadied, he saw her eyelids flutter, as if this simple touch meant far more than she could say aloud. After a moment, she leaned in, carefully watching his reaction. Her shoulder brushed his arm. When he didn't move away, she allowed her head to come to rest against him, soft and tentative. He breathed out slowly through his nose, steadying himself. Not because he didn't want her close, but because the moment felt fragile, something that could break if he moved too fast or let emotion show too openly. "You're safe," he murmured, just above a whisper. Naeli's voice came even quieter. "I know." Minutes passed in that quiet position, her head against his shoulder, his hand lightly touching hers. The fire warmed their faces. The cabin felt smaller, but safer than it ever had. She shifted once, leaning in just a little more, her body softening as some of the fear slipped out of her. Cole felt her trust settling into him, stitching itself into the empty places he had carried for years. When she finally lifted her head to look at him, her face was close enough that he could feel her breath. She didn't speak. She didn't ask anything. She simply watched him with a calm, searching gaze. It wasn't desire. It wasn't need. It was connection, quiet, slow-growing, and unmistakably real. And in that dim, fire-lit room, they shared a moment without words, two wounded lives leaning into warmth, allowing something gentle to begin between them. The next morning felt different before Cole even stepped outside. The air coming through the cracks in the window carried a sharper bite. A kind of stillness hung over the yard, not the peaceful kind. They both sensed it before a word was spoken. Cole woke first, as he always did. Nayeli was still wrapped in the blanket near the fire, her breathing slow but not fully relaxed. She had slept, but not deeply. Some part of her had stayed alert through the night, listening for danger even in her dreams. He eased away from the stove and reached for his coat. "I'll check the fence," he said quietly. Nayeli's eyes opened immediately. She nodded, though worry flickered through her gaze. Cole stepped outside. The cold hit him hard. Frost clung to the edges of the grass, and a faint trail of disturbed dirt near the gate caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be the wind, but the closer he got, the clearer it became that someone had stepped through the far side of the fence. Boot tracks. 2 sets, one pair heavier than the other. The prints angled toward the ridge, circling wide as if watching from a distance. Cole knelt beside the prints, his breath steady but growing heavier in his chest. He wasn't surprised. He had expected someone to come looking eventually, but he had hoped for more time. He followed the trail a short way before stopping. The tracks didn't come close to the cabin. Whoever they were, they hadn't approached yet. They were testing the land, watching, gauging. He stood there a long moment, letting the cold settle into his coat as he weighed the risk. His mind stayed calm, but beneath it, a quiet anger stirred. Not at Nayeli, not at the danger, at the men who had done this, at the thought of them trying to take her back. When he returned to the cabin, he found her standing near the door, arms wrapped tight beneath the blanket. She had seen his expression the moment he stepped inside. Someone came, she whispered. He didn't lie. Tracks by the fence. 2 men. Didn't come close. Her breath shook. She moved slightly backward, fingers tightening on the blanket. Bishop came to her side instantly, leaning against her leg. Cole removed his coat and hung it on the peg like nothing was wrong, keeping his voice steady. "They're scouting. That's all for now." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "They will not stop," she said. "They never do. If they know I breathe, they will look until they find me." Cole stepped closer, not too close, but enough to steady the tremor in her words. "Look at me." She lifted her eyes slowly, bracing for something sharp. "You're not going back to them," he said firmly. Her lips parted slightly in disbelief. "They will take me. They took me before." "Not here," Cole said. "Not while I'm breathing." Her chest rose quickly, then fell. She stared at him, searching for the gap in his confidence, waiting for the hesitation, the doubt, the part where he said he couldn't risk himself for her. It didn't come. He held her gaze until she realized he meant exactly what he said. Nayeli's breath caught, her throat tightening. She turned her face away for a moment, overwhelmed by something she wasn't ready to show. When she looked back, her eyes were damp but steady. "You would face them," she whispered. "I already decided that," Cole said. "The moment I cut those chains." She looked at him as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. Something raw and deep moved through her expression. Fear, gratitude, and a quiet kind of hope she didn't yet know how to hold. Bishop thumped his tail once, sensing the change. Cole didn't touch her. He stayed close, letting her feel his steadiness without forcing contact. After several long moments of silence, she stepped forward on her own, closing half the distance between them. "I did not want trouble to come here," she said softly. It's not trouble if I choose it, Cole replied. A long breath left her, slow, shaky, but freer than before. The danger hadn't passed, but something stronger than fear had started to take shape between them. Naeli lifted her hand slightly, uncertain, hesitant, then rested her fingers against his sleeve. She didn't grip it. She didn't cling. She just touched him lightly, anchoring herself to the promise he had given her. Cole didn't move. He let her lean closer, let her steady her breathing on her terms. The trust in that small touch felt stronger than anything spoken. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the cabin walls. Inside, Naeli's fears slowly gave way to something steadier. Not safety, not yet, but belief. Belief that she no longer faced the world alone. The air turned colder as the day wore on, thick with the kind of stillness that warned of riders approaching long before they were seen. Cole felt it first, the subtle shift in the wind, the way Bishop stayed close to Naeli instead of wandering the yard. Even the horses in the small corral paced more than usual, hooves thudding anxiously against the frozen ground. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low enough to stretch the shadows long across the fields. Cole stood on the porch, scanning the horizon with calm, steady eyes. Naeli watched him from the doorway, fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You see something?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," he replied, though his tone held the weight of someone expecting something any moment. "But I hear them." Naeli stepped out beside him before she realized what she was doing. Her feet stopped just before crossing onto the porch. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from anticipation, memory, fear. "They will come back with others," she said. "They always come back with others." Cole lowered his gaze to her face. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't panicking. She was preparing herself for the worst because she had never been given a reason to expect better. "We'll be ready," he said simply. She stared at him, searching his face, looking for doubt. She found none. Cole's steady calm wasn't bravado. It was experience, the quiet strength of a man who'd survived long enough to understand exactly how far he was willing to go. Before she could answer, a faint sound drifted across the open land. Horses. Far off, but real. Naeli's breath hitched. She took one step back, only to stop when Bishop pressed his body against her leg, grounding her. Cole turned his head toward the ridge and narrowed his eyes. Two silhouettes appeared for only a heartbeat before disappearing behind the slope again. "They're checking the land," Cole said, "trying to see who lives out here. They'll circle wide first." Naeli wrapped her arms around herself, but it wasn't the blanket she held onto. It was the fear she'd carried for weeks. That fear had almost killed her once. She fought it now with clenched teeth. "They took everything from me," she said, her voice low, controlled. "My Nalma, my treta, my plaza." Cole stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence anchoring her against the storm gathering beyond the ridge. "They don't get to take this," he said. "Not the life you're building now. Not your chance to start again." She blinked hard, her throat tightening. She had no words for what he was offering. Protection without ownership, safety without force, a place in the world without conditions. The horses' hoofbeats grew faint again, fading behind the ridge. "Won't be today," Cole murmured. "They're measuring distance. They'll return when they think you're alone." Naeli nodded slowly. The fear didn't melt away, but it shifted, no longer choking her, no longer the only thing she felt. She glanced at Cole's hands, the quiet steadiness in them. Something inside her loosened, a knot she'd carried since the graveyard. As evening settled in, Cole pulled the door, closed behind them, and lit the lamps. The room warmed quickly, the fire burning strong. Naeli stood in the center of the cabin, staring at the flames, her face lit by the flickering orange glow. "They will not stop," she said again, more to herself than to him. Cole stepped beside her. "Neither will I." She looked at him slowly, her eyes tracing the calm lines of his expression. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she reached out, not trembling this time, and placed her hand over his. He didn't close his fingers around hers. He let her decide the pressure, the pace, the meaning. She held on tighter, grounding herself in a choice she'd never been given before. "They will not take me," she whispered. "No," Cole said. "They won't." Her hand remained on his. Her breathing steadied. The fear in her eyes softened into something else, something like resolve. They stayed like that for several minutes, standing close in the warm light of the fire, Bishop settling at their feet as if claiming the space beneath them. The sound of horses never returned that night. But the danger was real, and both of them knew it. Only now, for the first time, Naeli faced it with someone beside her. Not a captor, not a stranger, not a passing mercy. Someone who had chosen to stand between her and the world. Someone she was beginning to trust enough to stand with. The morning arrived quiet and pale, the kind of stillness that seemed to settle over the land after a night of wind and worry. Frost clung to the grass, turning the yard into a sheet of brittle silver. Cole stepped outside first, scanning the fields in every direction before letting the tension leave his shoulders. No riders, no tracks, no sign of the men who had circled the ridge. Inside, Naeli stood near the table, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her days ago. She looked stronger this morning, still thin, still carrying the memory of what had been done to her, but steadier on her feet, her eyes clearer. Bishop stayed close to her side, as if he had accepted her as part of the home now. Cole shut the door behind him. "They're gone," he said simply. Naeli exhaled, a slow, deep release that eased the tightness in her chest. She lowered her gaze. "I want to see it," she said quietly. "Where you found me." Cole didn't question her. He only nodded once, respectful of the weight behind her request. They walked together toward the graveyard, moving slowly across the frost-covered grass. The air bit at their cheeks, but the sun rising behind them softened the cold. Naeli kept close to Cole, not in fear, but in intention, choosing his presence, not hiding in it. When they reached the broken gate, she paused. Her breathing changed. Her eyes traced the leaning headstones, the brittle grass, the cracked markers that had stood silent while she suffered here. Cole didn't touch her. He let her take her time. Naeli stepped forward on her own. Her boots pressed lightly into the soil, leaving prints where once her body had been dragged and abandoned. Bishop followed a few steps behind, nose lowered, as if recognizing the scent that had once driven him to return night after night. They reached the place between the two headstones. The chains were gone, but the indentations remained, a subtle mark in the earth where the metal had lain pressed against stone. Naeli lowered herself to her knees slowly, her fingers touching the cold ground. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply breathed, steady and quiet, reclaiming the space that had nearly taken her life. Cole watched her, chest tightening, not from fear but from respect. She wasn't revisiting pain. She was taking back control. After a long silence, she spoke. "I thought I would die here." Her voice held no bitterness, only truth. Cole stepped closer, stopping beside her. "You didn't," he said. "You lived. You walked out with me." She looked up at him, her dark eyes steady. "Yes," she whispered. "With you." She reached down and lifted the small pile of broken chain links Cole had collected earlier that morning. Their rusted weight sat in her palm. Without ceremony, she placed them into the shallow hole she had dug moments before. She covered them with dirt, pressing the soil flat with her hands. "No more," she said. A final act, a quiet burial, the end of what those men had tried to make of her. When she stood, she wavered slightly, and Cole steadied her with a light touch to her arm. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she turned toward him fully. "I stay," she said softly. "If you want." Cole's breath caught, not from surprise, but from what the moment meant. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair gently behind her ear. She leaned into the touch, eyes softening. "I want," he said, "more than I've wanted anything in years." Her lips trembled, this time not from fear, but from emotion she had held back out of survival. Cole lifted her face with the gentlest pressure beneath her chin. She rose onto her toes, meeting him halfway. Their kiss deepened slowly, warmly, born from quiet nights by the fire, shared meals, careful touches, and a long road from terror to trust. Her hands came up to his chest, resting over his heartbeat. Cole held her waist, steady and protective, but never claiming. Their breaths mingled in the cold air. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against his. "You saved me," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "You saved yourself. I only helped you stand." She let out a small, quiet laugh, the first sound of genuine ease he had heard from her. Bishop circled them once, tail wagging, sensing the shift in the air. As they walked back toward the cabin, Nayeli reached for Cole's hand. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She simply held it with a quiet certainty, intertwining her fingers with his. He squeezed her hand gently, matching her pace. The cabin looked different now, not a place of solitude, but of warmth waiting to be shared. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney. The sunlight brushed along the porch boards. The world that had once kept both of them alone now opened wide with possibility. Nayeli glanced up at Cole, her expression calm and hopeful. "This is home now," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Ours." They stepped onto the porch together, the frost melting beneath their boots. Inside, the stove glowed warmly, as if welcoming them both back to where they belonged. For the first time in a long time, for both of them, there were no chains, no fear, no uncertainty. Just a man, a woman, a loyal dog, and a quiet life waiting to be lived. A life they chose, a life they would build together.